join us.
Okay, so then I welcome you to the second presentation, and I hand over to Cyrus Shahabi, who is also from USC, and he will introduce himself a little bit. But I want just to say that he is also part of the advisory council of the Center for Advanced Genocide Research.
That was my introduction. Hi, I'm Cyrus Shahabi. I'm a professor with Computer Science Department, Electrical Engineering Department, and also with Dornsife Spatial Sciences. As mentioned, actually, I'm on the Shaw Foundation Faculty Advisory Board, and in particular related to this panel, my research area is on spatial and location data management, GIS, and I think that's why I was selected to chair the panel, the overlap of the two. The name of the panel is Beyond the Basics, the Capacities of GIS for Analyzing Holocaust Spaces. We have very distinguished panel members. I'm going to introduce each one before their talk. And I guess my understanding is that we have 15 minutes for the presentation and then 15 minutes for Q&A. So our first speaker is Dr. Alberto Giordano. He's a professor and chair at the Department of Geography at Texas State University. He's very well known for his work on the application of GIS method to historical cartography, policy analysis, and human geography. He is one of the co-organizers of this interdisciplinary research group called Holocaust Geographies Collaborative, an international group of historians, geographers who explore the spatial aspects of the Holocaust through digital scholarship. For his Holocaust research, Alberto has been awarded several grants and from funding agencies like NSF, NEH, and several Holocaust-related institutions. And he's a member of several national and international organizations, and is the president-elect of the University Consortium for Geographic Information Science, UCGS. Alberto.
Hi, good afternoon. Thank you. I want to thank Martha, Wolf, Stephen, everybody here for organizing this wonderful event, inviting us, me. I want to thank the audience. And I want to talk a little bit about GIS and GI science, and in a sense reflect on the 10 years that I've been involved in this wonderful project. I want to give some example, my take on what the GIS does and does not, and then also talk a little bit, reflect a little bit about collaborative work and what we've been doing together for many years. Let's do some definitions here, first of all. A GIS is a computer system, okay? It's not a theory. It's not a concept. It's not even a method, if you want. It's a system to capture, store, manage, retrieve, manipulate, analyze, and display geographical data. That's what a GIS is. GIS, we talked about big data this morning a little bit. That's what a GIS does. A GIS can handle big data with a geographical component. It is a model of reality. It is not reality. We had some conversation about the map, and is the map real? Is it abstract? A GIS and map are models of reality. They are not reality. It's important. In particular, the GIS is predicated upon the construction of geographical data. It's that definition of geographical data, location, theme, and the time. The GIS is especially powerful because of layers information sharing a geography. So for the integration capability of GIS, to put data together on a geographical basis. I want to define very quickly these three terms because I'm going to return on them later. Precision is defined as a measurement. So an example of precision would be the decimal numbers after an integer. So you can go very, very precise with the geographical location in latitude and longitude to down to the millimeter, which doesn't mean that it's accurate. Accuracy is how close a measure is to its real value. Okay, so that's what it is. So the GIS does a very good job at handling precision and accuracy, but our problem is it doesn't really do a very good job at handling uncertainty. And so that's one thing that we would return to. Now, geographic information science is the brain behind GIS. Okay, so, and I would immediately add my provocative question here. ArcGIS is to GIS science what Excel is to statistics. Okay, I'm a little bit exaggerating here, but not by much. Okay, so you have definitions. So those definitions up there are about the fact that GIS science really is about computer science, algorithms, data structure, models, etc. And the brain, the spatial analytical power, and concept ideas, algorithm methods of geographical analysis, spatial analysis, spatial statistics, spatial temporal. The visual display of data is very important. It's part of GIS and GIS science, but it's not the only way of representing geographical concepts displaying. It's the brain behind GIS because it defines the framework, context, and theory of the model of reality. In our collaborative, the Holocaust is the context. And based on the context, what you're studying, you can do things. Okay, so you have to be very careful. You really need to understand the context in order to use GIS and GIS science in a way that I think it's appropriate. Very brief example with building the GIS of the Budapest Ghetto, a project that Tim and Cole worked on for years together. You have sources there, some original documents, lists, maps of people, of places, of other things. Okay, that's your source material. It's very important, it's crucial, because most GIS applications are done in environmental science, and in which you go out and resample, collect a soil sample, or use a remote sensing image, okay? That's not what we're dealing with. A lot of the sources that we use, of course, were created before GIS and before the computer. This is trivial, but that's the problem that we have, okay? So we are missing information, difficult and impossible to read, conservation issues. Those are the parts that the GIS does not handle well. It's the uncertainty part. Okay, you talked about uncertainty briefly this morning. We really don't know what's missing there and what is the problem. You know, what this map was originally, okay? It's very difficult to work with this kind of data. So returning to the HGIS, so we have all of these lists, maps, things, etc. We build a table, okay, and then we put it on a map. That's what we do, okay? Now, I want to show a very simple example from the Budapest project. In blue are Jewish designated residents in the Budapest ghetto on 16 of November. In green, from 16 of November to 22 of November 1944. And in pink, from 22 of November to the end of June to the end of November, sorry. Okay? So this is a map. Believe it or not, there are over 2,000 dots on that map. Okay? So one thing is important, each building is a unit of analysis, meaning we can aggregate, okay, but we cannot disaggregate. We can talk about buildings, we can talk about streets, we can talk about districts, neighborhoods, etc., but we cannot really know anything about apartments. Okay? So one thing that the GIS does very well is this. The question that Tim asked was, do the spatial patterns of this ghetto change dramatically? The answer is not really. It's a geometric center of the spatial distribution of the points for 16 of November in purple and 22 of November in green. Okay? So the question here, did the distribution change? The answer is no. Why not? Because even in the many reconfigurations that the Budapest ghetto had, is still most of the residents were in traditional Jewish neighborhoods in Pest. Okay? So what the GIS does, GIS science, disaggregate the data, simplify the data, and unearth spatial patterns. Now, if you insert scale into this conversation, the picture changes. Pest and Buda, okay? Different patterns. So when you change the scale of analysis, new questions may arise, okay? Districts, that's what I was talking about earlier. The three districts, heavily Jewish districts traditionally, didn't really change. The same residences before and after, okay? So that's an example of scale and spatial analysis and reducing complexity and unearthing spatial patterns. Now, you don't need a map to show spatial patterns. This is simply a chart, okay? This is from Italy, and basically talks about the different spatial temporal patterns of arrests of Italian perpetrators and German perpetrators. In blue, and those are the thresholds, which is a very important idea and concept in GIS and GIS science. You always have thresholds, you always have model of reality, you always have these kind of conditions that you're meeting. So, closing time, closing space, meaning within 25 kilometers of each other, all of the arrests, and in the same month, okay? So the Germans operate in much more closing time in space than the Italians did, okay? So that's a spatial temporal patterns that you can unearth that does not require a map. Now, having said this, and I want to stay in time. Briefly, I want to talk about the limits of GIS science and GIS. What they do well. They do well space, connections between things and distances between things. They do well abstract representations. They deal with quantitative data and methods and with unambiguous data. So the data might be precise, might be accurate, but except for a very few cases, they cannot be uncertain. A case in which it would be an uncertainty you can deal with, if you have a map with a series of addresses of buildings with a number, the civic number, and one is missing, you can interpret, you can kind of guess, okay? It deals well with absolute space. latitude, longitude, physical distances in kilometers or miles. It deals very well with some aspects of big data, the aspects you can measure quantitatively and that have no degree of uncertainty. Okay? I think that the GIS is particularly good, and GIS science, at studying, in a sense, the perpetrator's view. What are the policies, how they are implemented spatially, and how do they vary from one place to another? It's a big generalization, but I think it's particularly good at doing this. What they do not do well is place. Okay, so place intended as Auschwitz. Okay, in an abstract view of Auschwitz is the boundary, the size, etc., of the place, the buildings, etc. The place is what makes Auschwitz Auschwitz. That doesn't really do it very well. With real places, okay, with qualitative data, with ambiguous data, with relative space. A GIS, no matter what they might tell you, does not understand that being near to each other is not like San Francisco near Los Angeles relative to New York. A GIS does not understand that, okay, no matter what they tell you. Okay, I haven't seen anybody doing that. Big data, some aspects of big data, so qualitative data, uncertain data. We need more functionality, more analytical powers, etc. I think it does not do well narratives, testimonies, emotions, ambiguities, uncertainties. So if you want a spatial view of the Holocaust, the GIS is your thing. But if you want to go to place or something a little bit more, the voice of the victim, I think you have to use something else. The solution to these are technical as well as conceptual and methodological. So it's not only a matter of finding a better algorithm or better system or things like that. We need to rethink conceptually and methodologically how we deal with place. And it might not require GIS, might be something completely different. We need a new model of reality, a new data model, a new data structure. Okay? Now, very quickly on collaborative. I've had the privilege of working with Anne and Paul and Mael and Arik and many others for 10 years. From a collaborative point of view, this is what I learned. So, if you want to do Holocaust, sorry. We started, in a sense, being multidisciplinary with our first time together, okay? And then we went to being interdisciplinary, okay? But I think, and that also, it's something that we talked about earlier this morning. I think that's what you need. You need transdisciplinarity, okay? You need to really work together, understand together the method, the tools, the concept, the limitations, the ideas. One thing I learned from historians, which was wonderful, is the respect that you have for sources. I think geographers as a class are a little bit more blasé with sources. And so, but transdisciplinarity, I think it's, and it takes time. It takes a long time. Thank you.
Time for questions? Sure. Any questions? Yeah, 15 minutes.
Well, first of all, thank you for that really interesting presentation. I want to disagree with you about the limits of GIS. And would you mind putting that slide back on the screen? Because they had a lot of interesting stuff on it. And so where I want to disagree is, if you can get to it, I don't know. I believe that the study of place, interpretation of place, can be adequately embedded and interwoven with the spatial analysis in GIS. And we've done that several times. Todd Preston was speaking earlier. Are you still in the room, Todd? We called Hypercities a geo-historical narrative platform. You can narrate, you can interpret emotions, ambiguities, and so on. You simply need to embed the narratives or the places. So to the GIS science, or to the machine, a place is either a point or a polygon. But we can comprehend that quite easily. So I don't understand, is there a fundamental barrier here, or can we mix the two modes of investigation?
I've seen a lot of examples of trying to do this, but I should say I see place as the spatial of the location, if you want, of social relations and integrations and social relations between victims, perpetrators, etc. in this case, and place as an attribute, and you can give attributes not only to the place itself, not only to the social relation, but also to the place. Okay, so I would argue that simply putting, and I'm not saying that that's what's going on, but putting text or even videos or things like that on top of a GIS or testimonies. So if you want to, so for example, you're talking about one neighborhood in Krakow, and you have a testimony. You can attach that testimony to your GIS locationally and have it play, okay? That's not what I'm talking about here. That's simply taking a fundamental model of reality with the GIS and overlaying on it a media, some kind of media. What I'm really trying to get to, I'm also giving the presentation for Tim that is not here. We'll get a little bit more on that there. But I want to be able to study social relations as they occur in a place, in a barrack, in a camp. Okay, what happens there? Can we represent it? Todd earlier was showed them a slide with all the links going out. Okay, that's interesting, but I challenge people to actually being able to say much about this, in terms of a synthesis of 10,000 links. Okay, so it's both a need for reducing complexity, unearthing fundamental facts or ideas or things that happens, but it's also, I want to be able to represent, and it doesn't have to be GIS, but I don't think GIS and GI science are the solution. I want to be able to represent in some ways, because I think it would be very useful for the Holocaust to integrate the spatial and place perspective. I want to be able to recreate, in a sense, the social relationship that leads to survival in a certain camp. I don't know if that satisfies your question. We'll talk more when I talk about Budapest, maybe.
Well, it was very suggestive. I guess I'm concerned, about the distinction between GIS is replicating potentially a perpetrator's view and the inability to capture the victim's view. And I guess to extrapolate further from what you said, I assume this is because you're saying that GIS is kind of maybe transcendental, totalizing, kind of keeps power structures in place, can see spatial patterns. You can, because ostensibly would be saying that the perpetrators could understand the extent in which the policies are being enforced. And the victims couldn't know that because maybe they didn't understand all these policies, things were happening to them, they have less agency, they don't have a synthetic. You mentioned the synthesis. So perpetrators may be more synthetic, victims less synthetic. I guess I wonder if that creates, I wonder if it strips agency from the victims. And so far as it does that, I wonder if it grants too much to the perpetrators, right? It's maybe their desired point of view. The perpetrators desired, I think, this synthetic, transcendental, totalizing power and so forth that you seem to be granting them by giving them the privilege of GIS as replicating that. But it seems to me that probably there's something going on where the victims also probably, I mean, through certain kinds of knowledge that we know, were able to understand patterns and policies, and I imagine there's kinds of agency that maybe are being removed from them. So I guess I would just ask you to maybe take me through a little bit more as to why this dichotomy is here, because it seems maybe problematic.
No, I guess I was basically talking about the fact that I think that GIS and GI science are especially good at creating abstract models, abstract views, and in general spatial patterns. Okay, I wasn't saying that. I was not saying that they are unable to represent the perspective of the victims. Only that if you think, I should also contextualize we're talking about testimonies and narratives. I don't think the GIS is able to do a good work with narratives. They could be the victims or the perpetrator, but it's not very good at representing narratives and oral histories and testimonies for a variety of reasons. One of the most important ones is that narratives are not linear. Another reason is exactly this, that when we talk with others, when we relate experiences, we use a whole set of relative and ambiguous terms that a GIS does not handle very well, okay? I'm not suggesting that the GIS is the perpetrator views. I don't equate GIS with perpetrator's view. What I'm saying is that I think it's particularly good at studying the perpetrator's view and how spatial patterns and the extent of the policies vary over, an area. That's it. I don't know if that's satisfying. But yeah.
First, I want to say this is a really fascinating presentation, and I want to dig in a little bit into this question of why you think that that GIS might have difficulty with some of these aspects, in particular with the view of the victims, and what I found to be sort of a really interesting point that you brought up in one of your initial slides was when you tried to lay out a particular model of what GIS data looks like. Because it seems to me that you are describing two different things. One of them is a methodology, and the other one is a type of a data structure. And you sort of, from a computer science perspective, right, you're describing sort of a lot of fundamental issues with computers, which is that you need to develop a data structure that deals with the problem that you want to deal with. And the question that I have is that, is the fundamental issue when you're saying that that GIS does better, with which you have this great. You still have the slide sitting up on the screen, right? That it deals better with quantitative data. It does less well with qualitative data. Is that a problem of the data structure for how you're describing how GIS data is constructed, or is that a fundamental problem with computers in and of itself? In as much as that computers generally have an easier time, and computer scientists and programmers have an easier time developing structures that deal with quantitative data and with specific quote-unquote accurate data, and more difficulty developing structures that deal with qualitative and more abstract ideas. And so, when you're talking about GIS as a data structure on one hand, as a methodology on the other, does GIS necessarily have to be computerized? And is perhaps the way to get around these problems to stop using computers as the only way to do GIS?
I think you're getting where one of the direction that I think I would like to go to. To your question, yes, GIS is both. GIS is both. Sometimes we forget, and that's why I put this slide here and the one before. We forget that the GIS is a computer science technique. But, so it has its data structure, data models, et cetera, et cetera. But it's also the geographical. So GIS and GI science basically are the intersection of both. Sometimes we forget that there are data structure, data models, there are limitations. That's why I say here, it is a model of reality. Sometimes we tend to forget that. I started working in GIS in 1989, so I'm a supporter of GIS, okay? But it does have a lot of limitation. As to your last comment, yes, I think we need to do something else. You know, I don't think maybe a computer tool, I still think that some kind of computer tool is doable. But maybe we need to think about something out of the box, very different for representing place. That's my, so. I'm glad I did it, because usually we just, oh, yes, great. So.
Thank you very much for this very self-critical and self-reflexive approach to GIS. I was wondering, I mean, with my very limited experience on basically viewing GIS visualizations, I was wondering whether and how it can be applicable to questions of mobility rather than more static questions of location. And there one might use, for example, material from the Visual History Archive or other audiovisual testimonies where victims talk about their trajectories, where they were born, where they hid, how did they escape, how did they move into space. And they're pretty accurate in remembering the very exact address sometimes where they were. So, you know, if you actually instill a little bit of mobility to the GIS project, then perhaps you might go beyond both the perpetrator's gaze, both the very bureaucratic and quantifying archive behind it, and animate it a little bit more.
We've done this. We've done movement. We've done it, and it's a way of doing. Yes, you can do it, and we have done it. So I don't think it solves the problem. It just adds this dimension to this. It's already in the GIS. So yes, you can do animations. You can do, yes. So.
Time for one last question.
Oh, Eric. I'm in trouble now. I'm in trouble.
You're going to see that I'm just a one-trick pony. My question is if you could comment on this issue of data durability in GI science. I think it gets to this, both back to this earlier question that talks about data structure, because if we do have a durable data system, like geographic data, we have data structures that perpetuate a certain model of the world, a model of how we store things. But so it might be useful just to talk a little bit about, since you've been doing this since 1989, you should have perspective on data durability in the geographic realm. So maybe you could reflect on that. And then I guess the follow-up is as we move into other forms, other data structures and other forms of geographic data that include, as you shorthand it, victim perspectives, does that change? You know, are there systems in place for geographic data that can be effective at storing those kinds of data, or are we not at the point yet where we have an ability to have that, and does it intersect with or overlap with this issue of durability?
I don't know if I exactly understand your question, but I'll try. If I understand, I think it's one issue is metadata. Do we have good models of metadata? So, and are they models that can evolve and change? That's one way of looking at this. The other is that, and you've seen it in our own project, and we talked about this briefly this morning. We have created a lot of data collectively, but we haven't shared our data with anybody. Okay, so it's not as much as we said we were going to do. And I think, I don't know if it really relates to durability, but it's an issue of metadata, as I say, how do we describe our data? And then sharing data, it's not as sexy as creating and analyzing data. And so we haven't been able to do it, and whether the durability of data, I have data from 1989, before you were born, that we have this going on for a long time, so sorry, but that I'm not able to use anymore because I don't have the software, the structure, the disk, the metadata for doing it. Can we do it? Yes, we can do it, but until we put more time and effort into these issues of sharing and making it available and even make it durable, maybe, I don't think we're going to do it.
All right, let's thank
Thank you.
one more time. So our next speaker is Anne Kelly Knowles. Anne has been a leading figure in the digital and spatial humanities, particularly in the methodologies of historical GIS. She has written or edited 5 books on this topic. She has received many fellowships and awards, including the American Ingenuity Award for Historical Scholarship by Smithsonian Magazine 2012 and a Guggenheim Fellowship in 2015. She's also a founding member of the Holocaust Geographies Collaborative. Anne, please.
Well, here I come. It's all 3 of us.
Okay.
Yes.
Can you introduce Professor Jaskot?
Oh, I can do that. I'm going with the order that I was given, not the order that you're sitting, but sure, I can do that. So the next speaker is actually Paul Jaskot. So Paul is a professor of art history and the director of Wired Lab for digital art history and visual culture at Duke University. His work focuses on the political history of Nazi art and architecture, as well as its post-war cultural impact. He's also a member of Holocaust Geographic Collaborative. That part is, I guess, shared. And from 2014 to 16, Jaskot was the Andrew W. Mellon Professor at the Center of Advanced Study in Virtual Arts at National Gallery of Art, Washington, D.C. Paul, sorry.
No, you got it right, Andy. And Marta, how do I get to my PowerPoint? Our PowerPoint. So it's a collaborative. Anne is the primary author, and then I'm also a primary author, and then we're also working with Justus Hillebrand at University of Maine. So I am GIS and Corpus Linguistics. Yes, there you go. So collaborative. Thank you, and my thanks as well as the organizers. It's really a great conference already. I didn't do GIS since 1989, so here we go. As we are quite sure that everybody in this room knows, access to testimony as a source with things like the Shoah Foundation Visual History Archive has been one of the most fundamental changes to Holocaust studies in the past decade. Now, if we thought about, though, all the words in every testimony, how might we think about approaching a corpus of as many as 300 million words, which would be one of the largest digital corpora of speech in the world? What methods may be useful for analyzing the large body of information while preserving individual voices and asking questions of space? One approach to these questions draws on the geographic concept of scale. The spatial patterns of the Holocaust can be found at many different scales, from the details revealed in highly localized studies of events to the borders, or to the broader, more general patterns apparent in the continental scale planning in the Nazi Germany and occupied Europe. A more sensitive geographical awareness of the nature of scale, particularly that analysis at one scale, is usually inadequate to describe or explain a phenomenon viewed at a different scale, reveals that the gaps between scales of historical analysis of the Holocaust reinforce what we would argue is the bifurcation between perpetrator studies and victim studies that Saul Friedlander identified and tried to overcome years ago. That is, integrated histories take the scale of the individual for the Jewish perspective and the scale of the system for the perpetrator's perspective. If, however, the full text to which the VHA index refers were available for digital analysis, we could visualize the many thousands of cases of forced movement during the Holocaust that the interviews contain, using scale to generalize within and between regions and nations. Developing a method to approach testimonies as a whole would thus give us at least some large-scale social perspective of the Holocaust victims. That is, at the same perspective that we take the perpetrator documents, in the same scale, that is. In our own work, our methodological goal is to find ways to combine scalable visualization and analysis with the attention to experience that is so necessary to understand testimony. Sensitivity to the scale of the question, as well as to the methodological approach, a mixed methodological approach, provide new possibilities for analyzing the relationship between Nazi and Jewish histories of the Holocaust. Now, in what follows, we will explore these issues through two related sections. First, we will discuss the development of our own spatial thinking and spatial questions as we turn to the possibilities for and problems raised by our initial experimental use of GIS to analyze the ghetto system. This section will focus particularly on the Krakow district as a case study. This work with GIS extends issues raised in our previous systemic analyses. But as with our visualizations of the camp system in Auschwitz, the problems we encounter with the GIS study of the camp also inspire us to turn to testimony, though not the kind of textual and visual analysis most common in Holocaust studies. We chose to test the potential of computational analytical methods from corpus linguistics and natural language processing for seeking and interpreting stories and specific expressions in oral interview transcripts. As with GIS, this digital approach has its limitations and inherent difficulties. We will argue, however, that corpus methods may provide important new means of mediating the historiographic and geographic gaps between individuals and systems. GIS and corpus linguistics, combined with traditional techniques such as archival research, point to the possibility of bridging individual experiences with local, regional, and continental events. As we established with our study of the camps, and you see Anne's map on the left here, visualizing the systemic elements of the Holocaust is a powerful way of probing the historiographic questions in the field, as well as raising new problems for research. Our first major goal is to establish a visualization in spatial change and continuity in the places of the Holocaust established by the perpetrators, including camps and ghettos. The U.S. Holocaust Memorial Museum's Encyclopedia of Ghettos provides authoritative information in narrative form of about 1,300 ghettos in German-occupied Eastern Europe. This information is far from ideal data, of course. However, the entries do contain a good deal of spatial information, showing great variation across places, from familiar walled city ghettos such as Warsaw and Łódź, to small rural ghettos that existed only briefly to concentrate the Jews for mass shootings. We felt that mapping these places and events in all their variety would be incredibly valuable. In our first trial, we selected two categories from our relational schema. When did ghettos start and stop existing? And what kind of labor were Jews forced to do, when and where? We limited data entry to the Krakow region. Our initial attempt at crowdsourced data entry through an online web application found many discrepancies in the interpretation of the ambiguous material. As a result, we decided to surrender the crowdsourcing idea. And by the way, I'm just giving you a kind of screenshot of one of our data schemas. So we went back to the drawing board, and we developed a new, broader database schema focused on capturing the information we were especially interested in: establishment of ghettos, labor more broadly defined, mass shootings, and deportation. So each has a spatial element to it. We are now testing this schema in hopes that we can more nimbly capture all 1,300 entries in the encyclopedia. However, the first prototype was not just an exercise in learning. It did yield data on ghetto opening and closing, although this comes with some caveats. What do we define as a ghetto? How do we deal with ambiguity of time? I'll explain and exemplify some of these with the following series of maps showing the creation of ghettos and their destruction in the Krakow region. I should note that in terms of the base map, you are seeing our data in WGS 1984, a world projection that distorts the shape of this region more than usual. The dots are all communities listed as ghettos in the encyclopedia. When the dot turns red, the ghetto is formed. The first map you are seeing is from September of 1939. As ghettoization begins under Nazi occupation in October, we see some minimal concentration in small communities in the east. And again, ghettoization is marked in red. In March 1941, urban ghettoization begins, and this moves west by April of 1941. Through February of 1942, we see a wave of concentration activity as ghettos are established throughout the region. Mass shootings begin for the first time in that month as well. In June of 1942, this concentration is also paired with the initial transports to Belgium. By mid-July, other ghettos are established as a means of implementing more efficiently and brutally the movement of more Jews to this death camp, deportations that are particularly active in August. The decimation of the community due to their action leads to the closing of many ghettos, a pattern that continues to November. At that time, 5 ghettos remain as so-called remnant ghettos, which are dispersed across the district and in turn divided into worker and non-worker sections. These are closed, including Krakow, by October of 1943, at which point only 2 small labor-designated sites that developed relatively seamlessly from their original ghettos remain. Now, this brief PowerPoint animation, such as it is, of our draft map shows the concentration and dispersion all too familiar in the literature of the Holocaust. This is the traumatic narrative that we are used to working with. However, it also hints at the less well-known dynamic between labor and genocide, a balance that changed radically from site to site and period to period. The concentration in Krakow was just as important to the establishment of labor as it was to bringing Jews to a center from which they could be deported more effectively to their deaths. Concentration and dispersion were central to the spatial experience of Krakow, but other patterns emerged that are equally compelling, particularly look beyond the major urban centers. 2 points stand out for us. The July 1942 flare-up of dispersed, less urban ghettos that enabled registration of Jews for deportation, which you see at the top, as well as the 2 labor sites transformed from their ghettos that still remained as late as 1944, which you see at the bottom. The instrumental use of spatial confinement in order to kill the community in 1942, as well as the persistence in 1944 of some of those same confined spaces for labor, which of course could also sometimes mean survival, raise crucial questions of research. When was a space of violence, of control? When was it one of survival? How did dispersion and movement help some Jews while dooming others? Did Jewish survivors experience these confined spaces in such a binary mode of labor and genocidal threat as the maps imply, or was this more of the perpetrator's understanding? So continuing our conversation that Alberto started. What this brief series of maps suggests is the temporal variation of the system of ghettoization in this one region. We expect to find different spatial and temporal patterns as part of the equation, something that GIS is very good at, but that falls short of an integrated history in Friedlander's sense. This has led us back to the testimonies in the use of corpus linguistics and natural language processing, or CL and NLP, respectively. We wanted to see what CL and NLP methods might reveal about the structure and content of the Visual History Archive interviews themselves. We were particularly interested in whether it would be possible to discern the spatial aspects of victims' experiences, such as the relationship of space to labor and to genocide that was suggested in the GIS of the Krakow district. We began with a close reading of a small sample of individual testimonies by survivors from Hungary and Poland. Such a proof of concept would be similar in scope to more traditional focus studies, such as microhistories, but would help us develop methods that could be scaled up to much further much further than any previous study, that is to thousands of testimonies, hopefully. This methodological move was initially inspired by the omission of many terms from the VHA index that are crucial for geographic research and spatial analysis. For example, the index tags names of firms that employed forced labor, but not key terms associated with the kinds of work at the site, which many captives were forced to do. Such terms as dig and carry, build, and we made. We therefore needed a method to create new search terms that we could then apply systemically across a large number of testimonies. Our long-term goal is to use corpus methods to explore patterns of experience and expression in hundreds and eventually thousands of testimony transcripts, and to integrate this analysis with the GIS Ghettos database. The first step was to test the feasibility of these methods with a small set of sample testimonies. We chose 10 VHA interviews with 5 women and 5 men. In addition, these interviews were from people that were in labor camps during the war and also were using forced labor construction activity in particular. In addition to undertaking a traditional close listening, something we all do, we also analyzed them individually, collectively, and comparatively with 5 basic CL and NLP methods, which you see highlighted here. Now, while we do not have time to go into detail, suffice it to say that the array of methods proved useful for exploring a variety of features related to labor and genocide, as highlighted in the Krakow district maps. For example, in addition to identifying where a word occurs in a given text or set of texts, CL, or corpus linguistics methods, can visualize its occurrence in the temporal sequence of the interview. In the testimony of Benzain Gutmann, for example, different words show up in different segments of his narrative, as can be seen using the concordance plot from a feature called AntConc. This tool generates a horizontal bar chart of the text, or the corpus as a whole, and marks each incidence of a specified term's usage in the text. Note that when Gutmann refers to work, the third line, he was usually not talking about his experiences in Majdanek or Auschwitz. Nor does work correspond closely to his time in the ghetto, marked in the 4th bar. This may seem an odd omission by the digital tool when one considers, if one listens to the testimony, and that he talked a lot about how, for example, he and his brother set up a rickshaw business transporting people in their time in the Warsaw Ghetto, where he was from 1940 to 43. One would expect work to appear quite frequently in this segment. This computational observance is confirmed by checking with the video testimony. As in his discussion of Auschwitz, where he arrived in 1943 after a brief time in Majdanek, Gutmann talked about construction, but used the term job and work relatively infrequently. Rather, he referred most to work in relation to the year and a half he spent at Monowitz and the Buna factory complex. He described Monowitz as a relative paradise compared to Majdanek and the Maine camp at Auschwitz, since he got somewhat better food. The work itself, bridge construction and then electrical jobs, also seemed to be of more interest to him, and he highlighted doing a good job in order to survive. Finally, this space and time were also associated with severe danger when he injured himself at the construction work site and begged his capo to send him to another job in the electrical unit. Simultaneously, a civilian there, a Dutch foreman, left him extra bread or left him alone to do his work and recover, so it was also a space of survival. The visualization points to this moment as a section with particularly frequent mentions of labor and work and at a particular place. And there's a quality of work in a quality of space that is captured here. It raises the question of whether labor connected to survival may leave distinctive temporal and spatial traces in testimonies, which may have happened in places outside of the more well-known environs of the major concentration camps and ghettos. In addition, it points to the semantic weight of a term, work, with a particular meaning to this survivor in a particular space. Does a similar pattern exist across thousands of testimonies? Applying the CL methods to this testimony suggests that it may be possible to analyze which relationships of space and labor were important social spaces, looking across thousands of testimonies. Other methods allowed us to look at the spatialization of labor during the genocide in different ways. W-Matrix, a set of CL and NLP tools developed at Lancaster University, includes a word cloud function that visualizes unusually common words in a select text in comparison to a reference corpus. So it's a comparative tool. We use this to explore terms for the places and experiences that individuals emphasized, comparing each interview's word usage to that in the other transcripts in our test corpus. Excuse me. The first word cloud visualizations we saw showed more or less what we expected to see. A more detailed analysis, though, led us to different kinds of conclusions about the relationships between forced labor and space. For example, the categorical semantic analysis available in W-Matrix NLP Toolbox attaches semantic tags to words and phrases, in essence assigning them to categories of meaning. Applying this method to Gutmann and Paul Schneiderman's texts, both who worked in construction, for example, again in comparison to the other sample interviews, revealed some interesting differences between the two men's narratives. Although both of them worked in a variety of manual trades and forced labor, Gutmann's interview appeared to be more dominated by the theme of work and employment. Pulling out a wide vocabulary of place references in the testimony through computational means can thus allow us to then locate such experiences in mapping through a process also called geoparsing, which tags each place with its geographic coordinates. That is, we can start to take these semantic words and place them geographically. Geoparsing places in our test sample of 10 survivor interviews proved difficult in the first round of analysis, not only because of topological complexities, but because of variant spellings and mistranslation of some places. The latter difficulties would be significantly redressed by building a comprehensive historical multilingual gazetteer of the Holocaust. Referencing transcribed interviews to such a gazetteer would lessen the number of omitted or misidentified places in geoparsing, and the idea here is to be able to place this in spatial terms. Thinking spatially with a variety of digital and non-digital approaches to testimony helped us to identify patterns that may help link survivor narratives to the broader systemic level of the genocide. These methods reminded us of the need to retain the particularity of experience and space for the Holocaust, its millions of victims, and the policies and practices of the perpetrators. We hope that the spatial and textual methods we explored here may be of use to a range of interpretive problems in Holocaust studies. For us, they demonstrate the value of thinking at different scales as well as with varied sources and methods. The possibilities of computational tools like CL and NLP, as well as GIS, of course, also point to the need for more collaborative scholarship in Holocaust studies, given the complexity and size of textual source collections and the need for multiple modes of analysis. Collaborative work is the only way that we will be able to approach a truly integrated history of the Holocaust. It will require the preparation of large data sets, more training of Holocaust scholars in digital methods, bringing computational specialists into Holocaust projects, and of course, rigorous attention to the historical sources that have always been part of Holocaust research. We should seek, that is, not only to integrate our history, but also to integrate our scholarly practice. Thank you.
And thank you, Paul. Really, really interesting. And I mean, it kind of goes along with things that we're thinking about a lot at the Shoah Foundation at the moment, because we are now integrating transcripts, in large numbers of transcripts into our search tool. My question for you, just in terms of thinking about the geoparsing, so in terms of associating place with, concepts or clusters of words, isn't one of the problems the way that a narrative or narratives commonly are in testimony, isn't the problem that mere proximity of a place to a set of words does not guarantee the association? Because you might have another place that's even closer to those words, which may be more relevant, or maybe something that's mentioned just outside the range that you've set for collocation, for example, that may be the appropriate one, and that people, drift off and do jump in terms of narrative. And how do you go about handling that? That it's not just, a clear line from the last mentioned place automatically associating to the next set of text, and then, in a linear fashion on from there. How do you go about kind of thinking about that and working with that?
That's an absolutely fundamental question. And I'll let Anne to talk a little bit about geoparsing. I think that what Ian is doing is really interesting there. But I would say that, of course, what we're doing, we're trying to take sometimes a non-temporal narrative and put it in temporal and spatial terms, exactly what you're saying. Oh, I had a friend who was at Auschwitz. It doesn't mean that I was at Auschwitz. It means that my brother or my friend was at Auschwitz. So, I think that's absolutely a problem. I think that one of the things I would say is that shouldn't stop us from trying to do this because many, and in fact, at least in my experience with testimony, the majority of places are actually places that they mentioned that they were at. They may not be there they're there at different temporal moments. And so that's the temporal dimension, I think, is something we have to crack. And the temporal dimension, I think, can be cracked sometimes with semantic tagging. So, for example, you can, or collocation in terms of seeing where family is mentioned, where memory is mentioned. You can pull out even the past tense of a verb, so it's reflective. So I think that there are ways in working with the corpus linguistic Lancaster groups that we may be able semantically to at least narrow down the number of errors in that. That said, I think those errors will always exist in the same way that there are errors that exist in the GIS. So that would be my plea for combining these methods and doing as much kind of proof of concept and scrubbing as we can.
I would only add 2 points, I think. One is that certainly at this point in our work, it is intensely exploratory. We are not assuming that anything is going to be conclusive. We want to find out how these methods may be most useful, most reliable, what they maybe should never be used for or used with great caution. And as you know, Crispin, it's an iterative process. So something that I think can't be emphasized enough is any digital work that I've seen in the digital humanities is iterative. It means you're not just using the machine, you're also going to the individual source, you're going back and forth and back and forth, at least if you're a scholar who takes responsibility for one's interpretation. The other thing I would mention about geoparsing, our colleague Ian Gregory at the University of Lancaster has more experience than almost anyone at this point in trying to parse historical, except for people in the Republic of Letters project, in trying to parse historical place names and geolocate them. And he is fascinated by the Holocaust project because it is so difficult. It's the most gnarly one, they tell us at Lancaster, of any project they've ever tried to geoparse because of multiple languages and spellings and idioms and so forth. We went into our relationship with them thinking, oh, let's map trajectories. Let's, recreate thousands of people's movement through the Holocaust. That is now looking impossible and foolish. But again, it's an exploratory process, and it may be that narratives by people who grew up speaking English and German have the clearest transcription, memory of place names that can then be mapped, but trying to map the movements of people caught up in the horrors of Ukraine won't make any sense with these methods, just off the top of my head. But so lots of possibilities. We don't know yet what's going to work.
So I have a kind of ambient concern maybe, or confusion probably, about the temporal dimension. And I guess it's this. I mean, when you're looking at these testimonies, obviously the words chosen by the witness are inflected by his or her own sense of what his or her experience was. But they're also, those word choices are also determined by prevailing conventions governing the giving of testimony, right? So the use of those terms is not natural in any way, right? Like there's all kinds of forces impinging on the testifier, or the person giving testimony, that in a sense over-determine in some way the particular word choices. And what I think is really interesting is that if you look at testimony given by a witness at various distances from the atrocity, the word choices may change, and the density of certain clusters of choices will also change. So when I think about temporality, I'm thinking actually about a kind of longitudinal tracking of the clustering of certain kinds of language in testimony for a particular witness, which may tell us something about, amongst other things, the shifting nature of the overarching conventions that structure and make meaningful and recognizable the giving of testimony. So I'm wondering, and partly, like, I mean, you talked about Gutmann and Schneiderman, were they equally distant from the events when they provided their testimony? And if not, then what's the use of actually comparing the testimony, except to find out if certain clusters of words are there? And then again, I'm not sure that we're able to conclude anything other than at this particular moment in time, these were the words that made the most sense to capture that experience. So the question is really like, are you planning any longitudinal kind of study involving single witnesses? Because I think there's actually quite a lot that can be ascertained from that.
Do you mean single witnesses that have given testimony over time?
Absolutely.
Yeah. So, well, there's I'll do a quick stab at this. One thing that I think is really interesting is, I would agree with you, that idea that they're at a particular point. As far as I remember, the Gutmann and Schneiderman, they were both kind of within the first 3 years of the Shoah Foundation. So they're both kind of mid-90s, mid to late 90s kind of testimonies. What I think is really interesting, and we didn't have time to emphasize, is that for Gutmann, why I liked Gutmann is when that showed up, there was really a correlation between the kind of quality of what he meant by work, a spatial element, and a time element in his history. So we were getting, again, a survivor's perspective on what was important in terms of space and labor, not a perpetrator's perspective on what was important in space and labor. I thought that's great. And then we looked at Schneiderman, and it's not there, right? And these are just two testimonies. I mean, it's a random sample, it's a proof of concept here. But it begs the question of whether that can be somehow scaled up and parsed. That said, I think you're absolutely right. There are really a lot of different kinds of testimony. Obviously, there's also people that have looked at testimony over time. That would certainly be something I think we would need to do as well, to talk about the temporal dimensions of the language of testimony.
Rhetorical studies of testimony can certainly benefit from the use of these methods.
I want to also come to the question of language, and so you are working right now, and this has a reason with the English transcripts, right? And so I'm wondering, what is the influence of, first of all, they are mostly taken, or many of them are taken here in the United States. There's a certain narrative which is kind of feeds into these testimonies. Second, the second problem is that they are non-native speakers, many of them, or most of them. So when you do a text analysis, there needs to be an influence on this. And I think if you would compare, let's say, or could compare this with a kind of a text analysis in native tongue, let's say in Russian or in Polish or in French, it would be, I think, a very important corrective, possibly. So just saying that this is where, because first you think you have a lot of transcripts to work with, but there is a certain problem also with it.
I see what we're doing and what Gabor Toth is doing and a few other folks with linguistic methods with testimony, at least in the Holocaust, as 5 years of kind of figuring out what may be interesting to do. In the meantime, linguists around the world are developing corpus analytical tools in more and more and more and more languages. So maybe 5 or certainly 10 years from now, we can do all Holocaust testimony in original languages as well as English and take those things into account. So I would say watch this space.
We have one last question.
The switching between languages. Many of you who are attending the conference speak other languages, but yet as academics, you are able to stay within one language. Like the conference takes place in English, and you stay within that. But working class people often don't do that. Similar to what we see here with Spanglish. A working class person in Poland would often, in the same sentence or paragraph, switch between Polish, Yiddish, and they would just keep switching and switching even within one sentence. So you could hear somebody say something like, let's say, I worked so hard that my feet were killing me. And maybe they would choose the word work in German because that's a good word in German. They might switch to Polish for the word feet, and they might switch back to Yiddish. But when they're giving testimony, they're not allowed to operate in that naturalistic way for themselves.
Actually, I would say no. Ben Gutmann is a really good example. There's German, there's Yiddish, and there's a little Polish in there too, just for fun. No, so it's Wolf is right. He's now an English speaker. But the reason we started with such a small sample was so that we could really compare. We could listen closely, that's a more traditional method, and also do the computational analysis to see whether there was a conjunction, which meant we were able to make sure that when it was transcribed, there was a lot of transcription errors, for example, with Yiddish. And so we were able to correct that to make sure that the Yiddish was preserved and the German was preserved and the Polish was preserved. But you're right. That is a problem with the testimony. It's also the problem with what Anne mentioned with corpus linguistics is that, you could do a corpus linguistic analysis of an English corpus, and you can do one of a German corpus and a Polish corpus, but we can't do comparative corpus work yet.
Not yet.
Yeah.
All right. Let's thank the speakers, both Paul and I. So our next speaker is not here, so I'm not going to introduce, but Alberto going to do the talk. So, and I already introduced Alberto. So one more time for Alberto.
Yes, team is Team Cole. We worked together a long time in Budapest. Is meeting the president of his university today, so he absolutely cannot be here. But we did a presentation together. So I want to, in a sense, continue. In retrospect, maybe this presentation should have come before the GIS presentation, but it also connects to the presentation that Paul and Anne and Justus just brought together. I'm going to continue a little bit with the example from Budapest, and we are going to talk about corpus linguistics and GIS. I want to show you 3 maps here, and these are simple maps. They show walking distances from the dots, the residences, to market halls. Okay, this is an example with market halls. These are the isolated residences. So these are the residences that are over half an hour, actually over than an hour away from the market halls. So this is, in a sense, is a way of representing movement that we were talking about earlier. This is the same map, same idea, walking distances to the Swedish legation. This is Wallenberg. And these are the Swedish legations. And it's an important part of this whole narrative because you went here to get papers to then go to the international ghetto, the protected ghetto of Budapest, which was in this district. Okay, so that's the second example. One thing that is very interesting, and one thing that started getting us talking about place and thinking about place and social relationship, is that the people who ended up here are not the people who live close here. So the people who end up in these protected, again, were the ones that had the means. There were, a social class, perhaps, that was above the, the working class Jew. They mostly lived in this area. Okay. So, and this is a similar hospital. So one thing that we did here was to think about these as the invisible walls that separated, in a sense, a spatial invisible walls that separated people living in the core. So we can talk about core and periphery walls that prevent some of these people access to hospitals, market halls, Swedish legation, protective papers in a spatial way. Now, one important thing is spatial barriers can be overcome by social networks. And we'll talk about that a little bit earlier. Now, one thing that is so different from Budapest and Italy, for example, that Jews were forced to move from their residences into these buildings in which they were segregated by apartment. And a key strategy of survival for Jews here was to stay put, stay as close as possible to where you originally lived because you had your networks of people that you could rely on. So staying put was a key strategy of survival in Budapest, and it was not, for the most part, in Italy, the other Holocaust case study that I worked on. In Italy, movement was key to survival, trying to go to Switzerland, trying to go in hiding, etc. A movement was much easier in Italy than it was, in a sense, here in Budapest. So one other thing is that, of course, social relations, this leads us, in a sense, to the discussion that social relations occur in place. And in fact, testimonies and witness and oral histories, they describe social relationship, they specialize social relationship. That's what happened here, that's what happened there, that's who I meet here, that's who helped me there, etc., etc. So it is these kind of analysis and these look at the spatial patterns in Budapest and doing many, many maps like these that led us to the idea of, okay, let's look at testimonies and narratives as a way of understanding, adding to the spatial perspective. Now, we need to enter the building. So those dots are all buildings, all residences. Now, segregation, as I said, was conducted in Budapest at the level of the apartment. Okay, so an apartment inside the building, some were for Jews, some were for Christians. Okay, which is very interesting from a social networks and relationship point of view. So segregation, Jews are forbidden from entering for no matter how brief a period into either Christian houses or Christian apartments. Which brings us to one of the fundamental points of building this database. The resolution at which we build this database is the building. But actually, it's the apartment where we want to go in. And we don't know anything about apartments. Okay, so we need to listen to people, listen to testimony, even though Tim and I are now working on digitizing 200,000, the names of 200,000 Jews that survived, that were collected in 1945. And we're going to be able to map exactly where they were. So that's an example. That's the apartment part, which of course is a big technical problem in GIS. So inside the buildings, to go inside the building, inside the apartments, I have a quote there, and I'm not going to repeat the quote, but one thing I want to point out at you is how much the scale in this short phrase changes. From the apartment to the building to the neighborhood to the Swedish legation. So in this conversation, from a spatial geographical point of view, there are the social relationships, but there are also scale changes. There is a lot of scales in this narrative. So, back to, in a sense, the corpus linguistic part of this. If you want to study the Budapest Ghetto, if the testimonies and narratives and study the place, the Budapest Ghetto as a place, this is the sort of terms that you are looking into. So there is the neighbor, there is next door, the corridor, the staircase, the courtyard, the door, the room, the apartment. So we started looking at testimonies with corpus linguistic tools, looking for this word. So we're interested in what is the nature of relationships between people and the place, the space that they occupy. What opportunities did the public spaces and shared space of the apartment building offer? How were these spaces and places, forbidden and non-forbidden, were navigated and used for survival? what was the nature of social networks, and in particular, what was the value of pre-existing pre-war social networks with neighbors. So in a sense, the bigger question here is, how are the places of the Holocaust formed? Europe today is not a Europe of 1939. It's a different place. Okay, so I guess one of the big questions in all of the, at least for me and for Tim too, how did the Holocaust change the continent, but down to the neighborhood of the building as a place? You know, how did Europe get reconfigured, if you want? Another thing, what kind of relationship occur in highly controlled social situations like the Holocaust? So how does this relate to survival? So it's this kind of questions that we are interested in more in general. So just similar to what Paul just showed. So this is something that we did in Lancaster a year and a half ago. It is the same idea, and here is basically Helen and Maurice Farkas, part of the 10 testimonies that they were talking about. They are married to each other, but they met after the Holocaust. And here is the use of the word I and we from the testimonies. Okay, so this is similar to what Anne and Paul just showed. This is I, and this is we. Okay, it's just an example. What we try to do is the same thing with the 10 testimonies, looking for the key terms, for the terms that we had earlier. And I want to thank Mael for actually doing this. And so these are the 10 testimonies. That's where they talk about neighbor. Okay? This is where they talk about apartment. And this is where they talk about home. Okay? So there isn't very much there. Okay? There isn't a lot going on in these testimonies in terms of these terms. We were not able to access the transcript from Budapest because we don't have them yet. So this is a part of, we are doing this instead of that because we don't have Budapest transcript. But one thing that got us thinking is that there are different ways of exploring this testimony using these tools. One is perhaps general, more universal way of exploring testimonies that looks at terms like he or she or we or I, that some languages, maybe not Italian, doesn't have as many use of he and she and I as English. But there might be these kind of terms that you can use in a more general way, regardless of context of a narrative. So, and then there are ways of looking at these and interrogating testimonies that might be more contextual to the Holocaust. So there is a way perhaps of, and actually you guys showed it very well, there are certain terms with a keyword that show up. And that's what, Paul and Anne and Justus just showed. I would go even, what we're showing here, I think you can go another step. And the point is that within the narrative of the Holocaust, this is a slide that we used some time ago, talking about what CL, Corpus Linguistics, can do to study the 1,000, 10,000, how many testimonies. So you can do a broad brush analysis of gender, geographical, temporal differences, institutional differences, methods for identifying the exceptional in the testimony, connecting it to the 1,000 to the ones that it's important to do this connect. But then there is also a contextual to the Holocaust that is layered, in a sense. There are terms that perhaps occur more frequently when you relate to the Holocaust, and then there are terms that perhaps you can use, again, the taxonomy, that I like to do taxonomies, that perhaps if you are talking about a ghetto, words like neighbor and door and a building and apartment are very important in the context of those testimonies, whereas if you don't have a ghetto experience like in Italy or in France, maybe they are different. Maybe the spatial terms and the terms you're looking for are different, are not the same. So, for example, the point here is that I think this can be used to get to a theory of place and the Holocaust. So you can look at testimonies and see how geography, how places are described, and within within that context, there are different places of the Holocaust, different terms you can look at, depending on what Holocaust experience a certain victim had. Discuss as in this sense is we require analytical tools, a transdisciplinary approach, the things that we talked about earlier. Connected to these, when I was talking earlier about a GIS of place, and maybe you don't need a computer, one thing that I think I should have mentioned is that no, you don't for doing one testimony. But if you want to do 10,000, I don't see any other way of trying to do that kind of work unless you use a computerized tool for which we need new data model, data structure, analytical methods, and so on. And 15 minutes exactly. Thank you.
Thank you. Well, thanks so much for that. Is this on?
You're on.
Yeah. Okay, good. Okay, so now I'm a little concerned about your use of place. There's a really big literature in geography, of theory of geography, that wherein space is points, lines, polygons, what Lefebvre called abstract space. It's latitude and longitude, and place is our sites invested with meaning. Okay, by meaning-giving individuals. And I think if you, I thought in your last several minutes of talking there, you were reducing place to location. Location would be on something that GIS deals with just fine. I was really pleased to hear Paul and Ann talk about how this is an iterative project. So I think it's important to remember that when you're working with 10,000 texts, you're necessarily doing distant reading. And distant reading falls victim to all sorts of kinds of objectifications. And you guys are doing really sophisticated work in trying to bridge those. But at the end of the day, there's no substitute for reading and listening carefully and deeply to one testimony, because, as Dilthey taught us, that's intersubjective. Meaning, value, and purpose are only known intersubjectively through two interpretive beings. And I've seen Ian Gregory's team present work on the late Romantic authors in the Lake District, and when I asked a question of the presenter, it was clear that they had never read these novels. So there's got to be a point in which you leave place where it belongs, which is really in the phenomenological tradition. Okay.
Well, two things. One is, as I think it was apparent from all of our presentations, and actually Paul said that explicitly, we don't have an answer to this. These are things that we are exploring. It's ideas that we are throwing, and also getting feedback. But yes, it is important to read a single testimony. And of course, you get a lot out of that. It's connecting the 1,000 to the 1 that I put there, that it's important. But I guess our question is the same question that we try to answer using GIS. Okay? We have 53,000 testimonies here in the Shoah Foundation. I think what we are trying collectively to do is exploring ways of exploring. What can we tell? It's the thing that I was put here. what do I ask of one testimony? Okay, yes, what we were just talking about. But let's try and see, again, this is very much explorative, experimental. We don't have answers to these things, right? Okay, what do I learn by looking at 10,000 testimonies? You might say there is no value to that. Perhaps. But that's a question that we are trying to answer. It does not negate the fact that places, the characteristics that you just talked about. But again, this is what we are trying to understand. So, in a sense, we have very, very simple questions in a sense. They are not very sophisticated. But this is a very spatial, very abstract view. Okay, so how do I approach the problem or the issue? How do I answer the questions that social network and social economic class and things like that actually explain some of what was going on here? I think it's as simple as that. Oh, yeah.
Well, it's not just speak loudly. So that's just exactly the distinction between the social sciences and the humanities. Okay, so you talk very compellingly about the social relations are at stake. Well, journey to work and that kind of co-location is something that sociologists do in the social sciences. You don't have to talk to a person to find out that they have this journey and want to work. But if you're going to develop a theory of place, placefulness is a intersubjective phenomenon. One that, and I agree with you. You want to do a distant reading of 53,000 testimonies. I encourage you to keep doing that. But there's a very important categorical distinction in modes of investigation and inquiry between the scientific and the humanistic.
And it's exactly why we are dealing with place through testimonies rather than through GIS. Good. Okay. No. Again, I think it's the transdisciplinary thing that I put there earlier. That's exactly what we're talking about. I think we need, in order to be able to do something that goes beyond this view, that it's useful, but it's limited. It tells you certain things, but not others. Yes, you need transdisciplinary scholarships. You need to, new models, new ways, new conversations. So.
May I push back just a second on that, which is just the idea of place and space in the sense that there are millions of Germans who thought of the East as a very specific place in these terms, right? It wasn't a space, it was an ideological place loaded with meaning. We don't know yet whether there are thousands of Jews in the survivor testimony, whether they have similar kinds of concepts of space. Was survival located in a space in March of 1944? We don't know that yet, so we've got to ask that question.
Thanks for a really compelling panel. I have a question. I mean, you're dealing with testimonies as sources for creating these larger data sets. And I found it interesting. You showed a photograph of a door. I think it was in Budapest. And perhaps this is a question for you as well as for Paul and Anne. What about other visual sources such as photographs? And I'm thinking of, for instance, Yafa Eliach's Tower of Faces and the ways in which you could conceivably map the shtetl in Lithuania from which he comes using the data that are in the images. But I'm also thinking of found footage films, amateur home movies taken and then preserved by filmmakers like Peter Forgash, documenting experiences in places like Budapest, but places also like Holland and other places. But now, as well as the perpetrator footage of Willy Wies and the Warsaw Ghetto, but also now a growing archive of amateur footage that is taken and collected by Yad Vashem of Jews living in the Warsaw Ghetto using film footage. So I'm thinking of the ways in which film footage and photographs could also be mapped, if you will, to kind of get at the social relations that you're talking about. And even if these are staged or mediated, which they are, like any other source, it still seems to be invaluable to that mapping process.
Absolutely. And testimony is one way
Yeah.
of doing it. And Anne said it very well earlier. This is just like, in a sense, it took us 10 years to get to this level, to this thinking that we have collectively. I think it will take another 10 years. So we start with testimonies that I think are important, but then there's a lot of other things that can come into the conversation. And so, yes, absolutely, movies is one. I'm fascinated by the different that we talked about earlier this morning. A written transcript versus a video transcript. They are two completely different things. For me, I was talking to Martha about this. If I listen to testimonies in Italian, I get a lot out of it. I get something different out of it. So there is that part too. There is language. There is the media you use. There is multimedia. I mean, this is just a cloud of a lot of different things, I think.
Yes. First of all, I wanted to thank Shoah and thank you all in particular, because this was very enlightening, and I've been working and developing similar. Of course, I'm not a scientist. I'm not a computer native, but I'm just, very impressed and happy and learning. And first that. And second, I wanted to know what the parameters of, let's say, the interstices are with deep learning, AI, and the geoparsing, the sort of idiosyncrasies of geoparsing. If you could speak a bit about that.
Well, she can talk about geoparsing. I cannot talk about AI, but what I can say is that one thing that I like very much corpus linguistics, but I'm still stuck in a sense. And they showed something earlier, brother, the word brother. It starts here, and then it's here, and then it's at very, very end. And it's clear, or maybe not, that the brother that he or she was talking was the brother they might have seen, 3 days earlier because they came over. So these I'm a little bit stuck and confused and puzzled and wondering by the inability or the difficulty of understanding context and linearity. I think you need AI to be able to do that.
Two quick thoughts, because I know we're getting tight on time, about geoparsing. I'm really, really new to it, and I haven't done it myself yet, so I'm relying on colleagues who tell me about it. But geoparsing gets better and better the more your reference dictionary or gazetteer is tailored to your material. So what we need, as Paul mentioned, is a specialized Holocaust gazetteer, which will require collaboration across many institutions, and I hope we can find funding to do it. And gazetteers, some of you may know that there is a growing community of people working on historical gazetteers around the world, and they are, the leaders in that group are really arguing for augmented gazetteers, which are not just place names and locations and a little bit of contextual information, but seeing the gazetteer as a gateway to all kinds of information, including images about places. So your idea, Noah, gazetteers can actually become very rich databases about places, and I hope that will come to the Holocaust as well.
Yeah, I want to actually pick up on what was said about other records. So, for example, I was thinking about if you really go onto this micro level of apartments, to really understand them, you need the construction records of the building. Because, for example, we always read in the testimonies how hard the relationships get when several families are cramped into one apartment. The question is, sometimes I wonder, okay, yeah, a bathroom is problematic with 20 people if you have one bathroom. But did they really have bathrooms there? Because some buildings didn't. Yeah, so we need these records. So this adds 10 more years to your. Maybe you can. Maybe. Yeah, yeah, that's exactly what I wanted to say. Maybe you can actually shave off the time when you get more collaboration with people who knew about apartments. And I say this because I was always appalled by this very beloved movie, The Life of the Others, which is so acclaimed. And there's one scene when you know Berlin. You would never have shot this scene because there is this guy in the attic of the 4-story, 5-story building hammering on a typewriter. You would hear this downstairs to the ground floor. So the one who shot this movie didn't know Berlin buildings. So I think the knowledge of space and place is important and can help also to kind of shorten the time.
One more question, since you haven't asked questions.
Thank you very much. So a question, you were talking about this large-scale analysis along gender and space, Italy, Hungary, and so on. But the main problem is that the data is very much skewed. So wherever you see statistical relevance, maybe they're just related to the data itself, the way the data was collected and so on. So I'm wondering how you are kind of facing this problem. Thank you.
I'm not going to answer your direct questions, but I want to answer your question in an oblique way. This morning we talked about line of sights in Auschwitz and doing that kind of work. We actually created that animation, I think Eric did it, in 2007. And to my knowledge, we never published it anywhere. Okay? That's exactly the reason why we never published it is because, so we had this line of sights from a guard taken from a testimony, and this guard was saying, I was staying there, and this is what I saw. And in 2007, I think Eric did it. Paul and with Eric, well, somebody did it. And in which we say, well, you know, that's not really possible. We never used that. The reason we never used that, the reason I never really used it is that it's very difficult to describe an experiential situation with a line of sight, first. Second, we don't know the kind of data sets, the accuracy of the data set, the building footprint. Was it updated? Was it not updated? And the experiential situation, maybe there was somebody standing right over there, so he could not see this. So it's an oblique way of answering your questions, and I think that's you really need to know your data in order to be able to do these things. And I think I'm very suspicious of GIS applications that try to do that kind, because there are so many unknown, and there is the issue of uncertainty. So it's both the issue of uncertainty and the experiential issue. That's why, I think if we want to talk about testimonies and things happening, we need to shift gears and move to something else. So.
All right, let's thank the speakers. So last but not least, we have Mal Lennox. He's a PhD student in geography at Texas State University, and he's working under the supervision of Alberto. His main research interests include historical GIS and geography of the Holocaust, with a focus on family separations. He also cooperates, of course, with the Holocaust Geographies Collaborative. Mal?
All right, thank you for the introduction, and thank you for having me here today. I'm going to talk about something that's more maybe a traditional GIS, and that's coming out of my master's thesis. And I want to start with that quote from Anne Michaels, who's a novelist, and in one of her novels she wrote, "Does it matter if they were from Kielce or Turin or Berlin, or if one went first or last, or whether they were separated getting on the train or to the train, whether they were taken from Athens, Amsterdam, Radom, from Paris or Bordeaux, Rome or Trieste?" And where she's getting at is that for her, it doesn't matter. She's focusing on the fate of those people. But from the perspective of a geographer, and I'm saying geographer because I am a geographer, but I guess it's the same for historians and other scholars, all of that does matter, and that's the questions we're trying to ask. If we want to understand the victim experience, it's important to know where, when, how, and why did individuals and family get arrested, deported, and separated. And in that presentation, I'm focusing on the topic of family, which is to a large degree overlooked in the genocide and the Holocaust literature. It's not used as a unit of analysis, although we talk about family quite a bit. But if you listen to testimonies, family is something that we hear about a lot, and especially dealing with family separation. Since I'm talking about family separations and family arrest in Italy during the Holocaust, I want to give a very brief historical background about the Holocaust in Italy. You have some dates on that side and a map. And what I want you to take out of here is that the Holocaust in Italy was not monolithic. You have different territories. The one on the top top east part was administered directly by Germans. The rest of it was administered in part just by Italian. You also have different types of arrest. You have a lot of roundups that happen just in one day in one place where a lot of people are arrested at one time, but you also have a lot of a sweep of individual people being arrested in the countryside. And of course you have the German police arresting people, the Gestapo, and the Italian police arresting other people. So we have all of those components that happen in different time and space. When we look at the geography of the Holocaust in Italy, you have the work of Picciotto de Farjan, which is one of the most comprehensive statistical work on the Holocaust in Italy. And she presents the different stages, mainly that in 43 was those big roundups, mainly by the Germans, and later in 44 and 45, it tended to be more of tracking down people everywhere in the territory, mainly by the Italian police. And in that book, and Dr. Giordano talked about it a little bit earlier, there is a chapter about spatial temporal patterns of arrest of the Holocaust in Italy. And that was my starting point. I'm using their GIS to build on, and their database to build on and to look at other patterns, because they are looking at the arrest at the individual level. And starting from there, I'm trying to look at the arrest and the separations of families. So my research questions are, what are the spatial temporal patterns of Jewish family arrest in Italy between September 1943 and February 1945? Are those patterns different from the spatial temporal patterns of arrest at the individual level presented in the chapter I just talked about? And how often and under what conditions were family units maintained and or separated during the deportation process in Italy between September 1943 and February 1945? So the data, the original data set is coming from the work of Picciotto de Farjan, which she basically listed as many victims of the Holocaust in Italy as she could. And then that database has been taken by Dr. Giordano and Napoleon to build a GIS, and some of the data we have on it are data about the individual, so their place of birth, date of birth, their gender, their ages, data about their family, the father's names, mother's names, and spouse names when it's relevant. Some geographical data about, some data about their arrest, where, when, and who arrested them. And then a lot of geographical data about what happened to them after they were arrested, so where they were detained, where they were deported, and in which convoy they were mainly sent to Germany. And eventually, we also have the fate, did they survive or not the Holocaust. So starting from the database, I've been able to identify family groups, and so to sort of reshape the database and to add elements to the database. because we have all of those names of family members, you're able, by comparing the names of the family members with the other name in the database, to basically rebuild families. So in the original database, you just have all of those names. The first step was to connect those names, so build up those black lines, essentially, and you're able to re-identify the extended family. So for instance, everyone on that page belongs to the same extended family. And then the next step was to identify who was arrested together, which is what I call an AFG, arrested family groups. So an AFG is all the individuals of a single family that are arrested together the same date at the same place. And that creates some AFG units, all of those green. So we have 3 AFG units here. One where people were arrested in Roma on October 16, 1943. One where people were arrested in Roma in February 21, 1944. And one on February 2nd, 1944. And here we have Viventi Beniamino that was just arrested by himself. So he's not part of any AFG because he's just by himself. But so what happened is, from the original database, I changed the resolution and I built a different database where instead of the unit being the individual, the unit becomes the group, the AFG. And in the original database, I was also able to add some information, namely, were they arrested with other people or not? So with all of that, you can start looking at and comparing who has been arrested with family members and who has been arrested alone. From the 6,116 individuals in the individual database, 57% were found to be arrested with another family member. So 57% were member of an AFG. And overall, I have more than 1,000 AFGs that range from 2 to 20 members. But so here, because the AFG is the unit, the size doesn't appear necessarily. When we look at who is in the AFG, there is not much differences. We can see that there is slightly more children that were arrested with family members than when compared to the overall number of victims, which sort of makes sense. In terms of gender, the member of the AFG and all victims, it's roughly the same numbers. If we look at where people have been arrested, same, there is not much difference between member of AFG and all victims. And if we look at who arrested them, the differences is also minimal. However, when we start looking at spatial distribution, that's where we start to see more and more differences. So those are clusters of arrest, and the purple one are cluster of arrest at the scale of the resolution of the individual, and the green ones are cluster of family being arrested. And overall, the 5 clusters stay the same, but we're starting to see some shifts and some differences. And more interestingly, when we start looking at spatial temporal proximity, so this is the Knox index. That's what Dr. Giordano showed a few presentations ago. That's where we start really to see differences. So each time on the right-hand side, you have the patterns at the individual level, and on the left you have the patterns at the AFG level. And what we see here is that at the AFG level, the arrest tends to happen closely in time. And when we split up by victims, for instance, non-Italian victims tend to be arrested close in time and close in space. And Italian victims also tend to be arrested close in time and close in space. So overall, what we see is that family tend to be arrested into bursts of activities, which is coherent with them being arrested more during roundups. So that's something I tested on the next step. Overall, 57% of all individuals have been arrested with at least one other family member. But if we look at Rome on October 16, 1943, which is one of the roundups, we're getting up to 85% of the people arrested during the roundup have been arrested with at least another family member. And that's a pattern we can see during all of the roundups that I was able to identify. So, and it's not surprising, but we do see that family tend to be arrested more during roundups, or family tends to be more vulnerable to roundups. The next step was to look at separations, because for each individual, I have the data about where they were arrested and which camps they have been deported successively. And so from there, you're able to compare the trajectory of each member of one AFG. And more than half of the Jews that were arrested during the Holocaust in Italy have been arrested. 17% of the victims have been separated from at least one of their AFG member during deportation. And here I'm only talking about during deportation because of the nature of the data. I don't know what happens to them before. The only people that are in the database are the people that have been arrested. 13% have been arrested from their spouse. 11% have been separated from their children. And 11% of the children have been separated from their parents, and 4% have been separated from both parents. I ran a generalized equalizing equation logistic regression to look at who was more likely to be separated, basically. And what I found out was that Italian victims were more likely to be separated from their family members. The victim's gender doesn't really matter. So men and women do not tend to be more separated from their family members than other. Children tended to be more separated from their parents. The victims arrested by Italians or by Italians with Germans were more separated, and that's interesting because there is that myth of Italian brava gente, that myth that Italians were nicer and were less prone to arrest or to persecutions. That's not a definitive answer, but it shows that more people were separated after being arrested by Italians. So it sort of questions that assumption. It also shows that victims tended to be separated when they were arrested in 44 and 45, and they tended to be arrested early during the deportation process. So soon after being arrested is when they were separated, and not later as the sorting process happens. And finally, if I look at the places of separation, what is interesting is the big places where there is a lot of people, for instance, Rome, where you have 1,800 victims that were detained, or Fossoli Campo, which is one of the big concentration camps in Italy. That is not where most of the separations happen. The separations tend to happen in the medium-sized camp and in the very small camps where, for instance, in Comino Campo, 100% of the people that were at that camp have been separated from at least another one of their family member. So at first I was thinking, that those huge hubs were the places where people were being sorted and separated and sent to different camps. It seems to be not the case, that when people are with fewer other victims, that is when the perpetrators are separating them and directing them to different camps. In conclusion, I hope that this research shows that changing the resolution enables us to provide new insight, going from the individual to the family, and being able to compare. It shows a different story. It also shows that it also makes the case for geographic analysis, because when I look at descriptive statistics, there is not much difference between individuals and family, but when you start looking at geographic patterns, that's where all of those differences appear. And then just in terms of results, family groups seems to be more vulnerable to roundups than individuals. 1/6 of all the Jews affected by family separation were affected by family separations during deportation in Italy. And some individuals were more likely to be separated than other. Italians, children, individuals arrested in 1944, 1945, and those arrested by Italians. And finally, that family separations tend to happen more frequently in small-sized camps and prisons than in large camps. And that is it.
question?
If I may. I have a question about groups. You've made us aware of how interesting it can be to re-aggregate people in a very meaningful group of the family. But now I'm really curious about that 43% of people who were not arrested with a member of their family group. And I wonder if you know anything about them, if they were a younger demographic group, were they young men and women working in factories and perpetrators came and scooped up a bunch of people from work and took them away, or what do you know about them?
So I don't know much about them, but one thing is that because not everyone is in the database, that means that the people that I identify were arrested with family members are effectively arrested with family members. However, the people that I did not identify being arrested with family members may still have been arrested with family members, but if those individuals are not in the database, I cannot connect them and see that they happen. So we're working here with 6,000 Jews, over 10,000 Jews that were effectively arrested in Italy. So those are baseline numbers. The reality might be higher, but that is something I don't have the data to look into that.
Other questions?
Certainly, this is mainly a story of separation, but you also have data on some reunification.
Yes, so and I did look into that a little bit, and it was, I don't have the numbers on me, and there were a small percentage of people that were separated after arrest and then reunified later on. And I could look that up because I have the numbers, but not with me. And I was also able to identify some people that were not arrested together, but that belonged to the same overall family and that were later on reunited. And of course, that tends to happen in those big camps.
May I just add something?
Mm-hmm.
Yeah, it's so the parents, the perpetrators, Italian and German, said if they arrested members of a family separately within Italy and before deporting them to other camps, they tended to try to reunify them. And then when it was time to send them to camps outside of Italy, that's where it's more likely that they split them, in general.
You answered a question that wasn't asked even, I guess.
I wanted to come back to your table with the percentage, and you said Rome with the roundups, it's a certain percentage, but a smaller percentage, and then you have these other locations, and you mentioned that these were camps. So the question is, what kind of camps were there? Because there's a difference when you, for example, arrest somebody to bring him to a camp, or were these transit camps? So this is very important as a context for understanding these numbers.
Right. So those small, medium-sized camps and smaller camps were mainly transit camps or just prisons. So yes, and there is so in the database there is no difference between any type of places where there is detention. All of it is together. But the smaller camps tends to be very short-term prisons, or sometimes they mention them as camps, but the victims tend not to stay there long, and it's very localized compared to the big one. Yes.
As I understand, the separation when they were in camp is a kind of the result of the policy of perpetrator. But when they were arrested, is it a result of the intention of the perpetrator, or just an accident because not all family members were in the same place where they were arrested? How do you think it's an intention to separate people during arrest, or just an accident?
Separation at the time of arrest?
Yeah.
Well, I think there's many things that go into separation at the time of arrest. You have some familial strategies where people decide to split before the arrest. So people start to try to escape and not necessarily with their whole family, and that can certainly lead to separations. If you look at other places, like in France, for instance, at some point they decided just to arrest the males. So that leads to other types of separations. And then if the separation happens where for whatever reason someone is not at home because they're at work or because they're somewhere else, that leads to other types of separations. So I don't think the separation at the time of arrest, I don't think there is one type of separations, but there is many situations that leads to that.
Yeah, hi. Eric Leberis, I'm postdoc fellow at the Foundation for the Memory of the Shoah in Paris. I have a small question for Mael and maybe Alberto, and a more general question for all of you. The first question would be, does your work and research, Spatial, but not only, help to understand what is actually this original database, who could not be inside, and how can you reflect on that? And the other, the more general question would be, well, I'm very interested to see the different layers of thinking about these different projects, parallel actually, and I would like you maybe to elaborate on this and mention this back and forth between the sources and the layers of thinking. I would like you maybe to better locate the digital tools and technologies and science into these general process of knowing what happened in Budapest in 1944 and so on these where to locate and situate the digital thinking in your progress, because it's pretty sure you focus today on these digital tools and things, but your research is broader than that. So I would like you to elaborate on that if possible.
Regarding your first question, I don't think, and that's not something I looked at specifically to see who was excluded. There are also quite a few people that were in the book and that were not eventually in the database because we don't have all of the data for them. So if you're missing, I don't know, if you're missing for instance, if we don't know where they have been arrested, they were not included because then you cannot compute any statistics on them. And I know we also excluded all the people that were in some islands of Greece that belonged to Italy at that time because it was a very specific population. So those people are in the book, on Picciotto Farjan's book, but they are not in the database.
So in the case of Italy, we are especially lucky because we can account for about 90% of the victims of the Holocaust in Italy in Picciotto Farjan's book and other sources. Other cases are not like that. And this is an extremely detailed database. The fact that Mael was able to reconstruct families and this shift in resolution, I think it's very important from, geographical point of view, spatial point of view. So you change the unit of analysis, you see different things. But I'm glad you asked this question because, of course, you're bringing up the elephant in the room here and the fact that it's a lot of errors of omission here in the sense that our testimonies are by definition survivors. And so that is a problem that it is a big issue. So yes, the data set is limited both because we don't have all of the data, but also because for intrinsic reasons, we do not have really the voices of the people who didn't make it. We did a project with Anna Holian on Italians that tried to escape to Switzerland. But it was so puny, so little, the percent of the people who we have data out of the hundreds of thousands that left, that we decided, okay, we don't have enough. But of course, there's a lot of errors of omissions in all of these databases.
if I could, I also like that you said, where do we locate the digital? Because one of the things that, particularly working with Anne in testimony, but also our broader conversations, it's not only been a reflection on our sources, it's been a reflection for me on the historiography. So it was only actually last summer, after working on this for some years, that I felt like, well, what we were really saying is not just saying, you know, how do we interrogate spatial questions of survival and labor, for example, but that what are the conditions of survival? What's the environment of survival, and what are the preconditions for survival? Which is, you know, it just like a lightning bulb. I was thinking, oh wait, that book I read for my graduate thesis, Volkpingel, Häftlinge unter SS-Herrschaft. This is a great social history of what were the conditions of your existence that might have saved you as a group entering into concentration camps. Now, he was a social historian, and he worked with a very limited set of sources. He really needed a computer. But suddenly I'm thinking, well, actually, we're revisiting Volkpingel. We're revisiting that question of, are there conditions, environmental conditions, social conditions, conditions of labor, spatial conditions that help explain trajectories of survival, or also individual experiences that are exceptional. And that is, I think that's a book that's been overlooked. It's certainly one that I've forgotten, but that has come back. And I think that the way that the iterative process brings us back to not just being critical of sources, but of thinking about a critical view of historiography and the absences and what we've forgotten, I think is an important step.
Since you asked about the iterative process, I wrote down a few notes trying to remember what the last 6 months, year have been like, and approximately something like this. Reading as much of the Encyclopedia of Ghettos as I can stomach for some days, sketching out schematic designs with Justus for a possible relational database, doing a bit of trial entry, discovering problems through the trial entry of data, talking about it with Justus, and I had 2 other RAs at the time at Maine. Meanwhile, all of us gathering notes in a Google Doc, which is our metadata journal of the project, reading some more, calling Paul and saying, wait, what are we overlooking here? Calling Annika and saying, wait, but what about Belarus and the Soviet territories? Consulting maps, more group consultations, a new modified database design, meanwhile making diagrammatic sketches of the spatial relationships that are beginning to emerge out of the information and just the mind processing things, then re-entering data, more consultations, making some draft maps, and meeting again. And this is our process, and maybe it's what everyone in the room does, but that's what it's like for us.
I always thank you so much for sharing the process. There's so much is unclear when we look only at the product or the result, and so much is contained in the decisions and the back and forth that clearly is happening here. I wanted to go back to maybe a question that was raised potentially by Paul, but I think it's come back in all these presentations, which is there any hope for what might be called a qualitative GIS? And I ask this because I was thinking from Paul's presentation that maybe the way to get there, and now I don't think this anymore after seeing all these presentations, was through corpus linguistics. And I think of some of those terms that you put on there: pushing, pulling, coming, going, near, far, long time, many days, all things that are obviously very qualitative measurements. And it then became a little clearly, as I heard the presentations, that maybe the idea is not to fix GIS, to make it able to do something that it's really not built to do. GIS is by definition quantitative, and as Mael pointed out, I mean, there's some very interesting questions that can be asked and answered using GIS, and we're well aware of the limitations, but really it's about 2 distinct methodologies that maybe together, that is to say, we need to think about them together rather than use one to fix the other. So I guess my question is do we need to think about a qualitative GIS, or really are we thinking about the multiplicity of methodologies that need to coexist in order to kind of, ask the kind of questions that you're doing?
Alberto and I disagree about this. I think the answer is no, qualitative GIS is impossible, but Alberto thinks otherwise.
You're using the Q word. It's the qualitative GIS. And in fact, a couple of years ago, we wrote together an NSF grant proposal that we did not get in order to try to do exactly this. And I think there is a way of doing it. You know, it's not to go too much back in time, but in the 1990s, when I was a graduate student at UC Santa Barbara, with two other graduate students, we wrote an article on, again, the taxonomy of GIS. What does a GIS do? And if you revisit, and it was written like in 1991, if you revisit, if you take that article and you map what a GIS does today, it's exactly the same set of things with incremental. So instead of having one cluster techniques, you have 3 clustering techniques. But it's more or less the same thing. It does it much more efficiently, much better, with much more accuracy, more precisely, etc. But it's more or less the same thing. So I think I define the qualitative GIS as a GIS of place. That's what I think it is in this context. It's a GIS of place, which, again, probably calling it GIS is not the right way of doing, but qualitative GIS is a term that is used in the literature quite a lot. Will it look like a GIS? No. But what I would like to, my idea, one thing I would love to be able to show. So you can do movement. You were talking about movement. So you can see, you can see trajectory, and you can, topological network, whatever. I would like to be able to show and try to understand it and measure and compare movements of people and social networks collapsing and rebuilding. So the testimony of Salmoni, which is an Italian Holocaust of survival that I had the privilege of interviewing in January, he talks about place all the time. And he talks about what happened in Buchenwald as a locus of of social relationships. That's what I would like to be able to catch. And yes, can you do it? Back to a question you asked a long time ago. For one testimony, for 5, for 10, you can do it with pen and paper. But if I want to take all of the people of Buchenwald and try to, that were in Buchenwald, and try to build a GIS of Buchenwald that doesn't show only the barracks and the camps and the guards, but it shows actually this dynamic going on, that's what I would call qualitative GIS. Where, what it would look like, I don't know.
And I'm gonna try to keep these two apart by saying that as coming from art history or from social art history in particular, I would say that the answer to this is thinking relationally, and that when we think relationally, a painting is different than the object it represents. It can never be reduced, but they're relationally always in dialogue with each other. And so thinking relationally is a way of talking qualitatively, quantitatively about individuals and systems, and we can do that. I do think we could do that all together.
We're running out of time, unless you don't want to have coffee. But on that note, I think that was a nice summary of future directions for GIS, and I guess this works. So thank you very much from the panel and from all of you for the questions.